not enough light reaching the surface of the earth, glaciers grow, yada, yada. And so there's an ice age. Well, so what happens to all of us? You know, we're all sitting around here. I'm sitting in my backyard looking at the stars, thinking, why didn't I see meteorites the other night? But what happens to us? Well, so what is commonly held is that we're 5 days away from the apocalypse. That basically 5 days, you can see this in Katrina, that 5 days without services and people go nuts. And they start, looting, and they start, stealing, and they start hurting each other to get resources because there's none. And so that is what the FEMA camps are for, is that when you reach a point where the power grid becomes unstable and the FEMA food trucks are not providing enough food to our massive suburban populations that don't know how to survive, and our urban populations that don't know how to survive, and that's all over the world, by the way, that the instigators and the problem people will be thrown in those camps. And maybe they'll be executed, or maybe, I don't know, but it would be martial law kind of scenario. But that's what the camps are for, is that as things deteriorate, that's where you send the people that cause problems.
Yeah, and
you lock them up to try to control the population, to guide them through the descent through this unfavorable living conditions.
Well, that's what scares me, because the ex-CIA agent I had on the show told me that every one of these FEMA camps, you talk about how the Nazis were really good at exterminating the Jews. He said each one of these FEMA camps has a facility to do way more than what Germany was doing.
Probably.
That's
because
the scary part.
Since the insane genocidal Nazis, perfected that terrible art, I'm sure it's been 60 years. 70 years. I'm sure we've gotten a hell of a lot better at it ourselves.
Oh, yeah.
And I wouldn't put it past us.
Yeah.
But that's what I think they're for. I think that what they're for is that as things start to deteriorate, whenever that happens, the people who are looting, the people that are causing problems, they're going to get rounded up and thrown in those camps.
Well, look at this.
It's not for you or me. It's for people who try to steal our stuff.
Well, yeah, but then let's say you live out in the countryside, where you have maybe neighbors a quarter mile away from you, right? And you're smart enough, to have some diesel or gas, and you got yourself a generator. So you're sitting there thinking, okay, well, I can still have my power for 30 minutes a day or an hour a day to whatever, right?
Whatever.
And you're running your generator. Well, somebody's going to hear your generator. They're going to want it more than you want it, or just as much as you want it.
Inevitable.
And, and if there's a group of them, you're going to lose your generator and more.
Yes.
And then as they get hungry, right, they're going to be looking for food too. So, I mean, I
but
think
you also have to remember, though, is that if you have a societal breakdown, right, in order to get out there to where those more rural environments are, if you don't have the gas to drive there, you're hoofing it.
Yeah.
So if you're way out there, the chances of somebody hoofing it out there are minimal.
Yeah,
because they don't have the resources to do it.
Yeah, I'm going to say one thing about, I watched The Walking Dead, and the fear of Walking Dead.
Right.
Okay, but one thing, you know what? One thing that comes to mind, and I can't figure it out, right? Every time they need a vehicle, they go find one, somehow they magically get it started. But you think after a few years, I mean, I know what happens with fuel. If you leave fuel in your motorcycle for a year and you go to start it, it's not gasoline anymore. It's like goop. And
it's like gelatinous goop.
Yeah, it loses all its octane. It changes its, chemistry, chemical, what it is.
Well, not to mention the batteries are dead.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. That is, I think, a weakness of the show.
Well, it makes you.
If you want a better one, there's a guy named J.L. Bourne, and he wrote a whole series of books. Was it Day by Day Armageddon? Those are actually, I think, a lot better. Those are frightening. I really enjoyed Bourne's books. Those were really good.
No, but the reason
I'm a dystopian.
Well, the reason why I was mentioning The Walking Dead, a couple years later, right? 5 years later, the gas in the cars are still good. Well, if something happens and our grid goes down, whatever gas is left after about 6 months or 8 months, it isn't going to run a car anymore. So I got a funny feeling, people, and it's not that. Most grocery stores have enough food for 3 to 5 days, if that long, because people are going to panic. What happens when you run out of food? And it doesn't have to be a political unrest that can cause it. I mean, look at the meteor in Greenland last month. It hit near a military base. And they only found out like the day before it was going to hit. They weren't even sure if it was going to hit the base or not. It hit a force of like 2.1 kilotons. That's a big force.
Well, there's actually a really good there's a really good talk by Neil deGrasse Tyson. I really like that guy, and it's I want to say it's a Aura TV, and he's talking about an asteroid called Apophis, and at one point the guy is interviewing him says, well, is there really a possibility that Apophis would have hit the Earth? I think in another like 3 or 5 years. And he said, it's possible that it's called a keyhole, but there's like a rectangle in space. And because of orbital dynamics, if it enters this rectangle, you can compute where it will crash based on where it enters the rectangle. And then he goes, they call it Apophis, which is the the god of god of death. They didn't call it Bambi. That's like, that really set me back. But then, he describes like most likely it would hit in the Pacific. And he said, when it hits, I wouldn't want property in Malibu because you're going to see a 300 foot, just barely subsonic wave that's basically going to sandblast the entire coast. And it could be something like that. I mean, it could be a lot of things, but what I think that it is that I think there's something coming eventually. And I whenever I do a talk or anything, I always title it "Something Wicked This Way Comes," because something is coming. I don't know what it is. I don't know when it will come, but something is going to come because they're preparing for it. And they wouldn't prepare for it worldwide unless something was coming. Well, and it can happen in 5 years, 20 years, 1,000 years, but they're still preparing for it. And those preparations tell you that it's inevitable that something will happen.
I got a funny feeling. I never believed in Planet X before. I've been listening about it for the last 15, 20 years, but all the scientists that recently have been going to Antarctica for the past year and a half, 2 years. The Catholic Church has where they can study the stars in Antarctica that they built, a huge telescope. I
think they call it Project Lucifer.
Yeah, but the thing is, what I was told,
which is funny.
It's not that funny, but I was told by
it's funny, haha.
Yeah, that in Antarctica, the angle they can see. Well, supposedly, if Planet X was coming, from Antarctica, they could actually see it for a lot of different reasons. One, of the angle. Also, it's not all full of pollution, where they can see farther out than they can anywhere else in this world. But there has been reports by some believable scientists that Planet X has appeared. And that is kind of scary, because they say if it is Planet X, and if it hits, it doesn't hit Earth, but it comes very close to Earth every 3,600 and 500 years or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, if that's the case, we're maybe looking a year off before, we look outside and we see this huge planet coming our way.
That's the one thing that I've tried to be very good about, is that I don't try to determine what's coming. I just look for the preparations. And the preparations are there. and the seed vault at Svalbard, everybody looks at us, the seed vault. It's one of, well, there were 13, I think, but one was destroyed because it was near Mount Pinatubo. So when Mount Pinatubo erupted, it actually destroyed one of the seed vaults. But there are 12 seed vaults spread around the world. And when you look at these things, it's like the chemtrails, right? Chemtrails. There's a chemtrail fleet. I'm sorry, guys, there's no chemtrail fleet. Chemtrails are real. Geoengineering is real. And there's actually a term for it. But in fact, Dr. Edward Teller, who's the father of the hydrogen bomb, he wrote an essay on it called Sunscreen for the Planet Earth. And, I believe that the chemtrails exist for a very important reason. I'll get to that in a second. But there's no fleet. There's no chemtrail fleet. They mix that crap into the fuel. It's in every plane. There's no fleet because they use every plane that goes around every square inch of the earth every day. And the reason that I believe it is that a very funny thing happened when 9/11 occurred, right? And it was a terrible day for everybody. But when it occurred, they grounded all the planes. Remember that? For 3 days. So all these atmospheric scientists were like, oh my God, the planes are grounded for 3 days. We got to go take measurements. Nothing like this has ever happened, and it probably will never happen again. So all these guys ran out into the fields and started floating all these balloons and trying to see what happened when there are no airplanes. Well, guess what? The amount of light that reached the surface of the earth dramatically increased. The overall temperature increased. And they termed it something called global dimming. That, probably most of your listeners have probably experienced this. That, on a normal day, not during the summer, maybe just this fall is kind of kicking in, or it's just kind of spring, it's no craziness. There's not a ton of clouds, just a few clouds. It's like a normal day, not too hot, not too cold. But you kind of get this feeling like everything's just a little darker than it used to be. That it's not as like radiant and bright and vibrant. The grass just doesn't look as vibrant as I remember when I was a kid. You ever have that moment?
Well, you know what? I'll be honest with you. Last week I was just sitting there telling my wife, I've noticed it going on probably the last 3 or 4 years. Here we are in August, right? I remember August that you go outside, it used to be really bright, and now, when I leave the house around 11 o'clock, it's not really bright out. I mean, the sky is blue, it's in the 80s, but you know what? It seems to be not as bright. And then I noticed like my garden and stuff, which I didn't really do this year, but I noticed the last couple of years my plants weren't doing what they normally do. I mean,
right.
And then I've actually had a scientist tell me that they have been spraying this stuff for the last few years. You're right. They mix it in most of the planes. The fuel, it's mixed in there. It's not the Air Force doing it or the government. It's mixed in all the planes that are flying. Because what? When I was a kid, there was jets flying. And when I was in my 20s, there was jets flying. In 30s, and when I was in my 40s, there were jet flying. I didn't notice all the chemtrails following the planes. It's only been in the last maybe 10 years, 15 years, and it's gotten worse and worse.
They started... So the genesis of all this goes back to, I think it's like 1957. And there was Scripps Oceanographic Institute. There was a guy named Roger Revelle. And Roger Revelle was an oceanographer and a biologist. And he carried out a pioneering study of phytoplankton. Now, in school, when you learn about air, they teach you that the air is scrubbed by the trees, which is true. And it's also scrubbed by the phytoplankton, that the phytoplankton, convert carbon dioxide into oxygen or whatever. And they're a very critical component to us keeping the air clean. In 1957, he did this study, and he realized that the phytoplankton were only scrubbing at about 50 to 60% of what they believe